This week's parsha is the most important parsha in the entire Torah. You may ask, why is this week's parsha the most important in the entire Torah? Well, let me tell you. Parsha Vayishlach covers Yaakov's return to his homeland, his confrontation with Esav, his wrestling with an angel leading to the changing of his name to Israel, the story of Dinah being kidnapped and raped, and the response of her brothers, Hashem reconfirming Yaakov's blessings and name change, the birth of Benjamin, the death of Rachel, Yaakov and Esav coming together to bury their father, and the Toldot of Esav. But none of that is why this is the most important parsha in the entire Torah. The reason this is the most important parsha is because it reminds us that reading the Torah one parsha at a time, with a week in between, is not the ideal way to learn and causes us to lose context, connections, and understanding. Let's start by taking a look at the opening story in this week's parsha, the story of Yaakov's reunion with Esav. We start with Yaakov sending messengers, or maybe angels, to Esav in Seir, letting him know that he was returning and hoping to reconcile. But it turns out that Esav was already on his way to meet Yaakov, which presents our first question. Why was Esav already on his way to meet Yaakov? How did he know that just then, after 20 years, Yaakov was returning home? Let's hold on to that question. But Esav wasn't coming alone. He had with him 400 men. Now, maybe these 400 men were the welcoming committee, or maybe they were a marching band to celebrate Yaakov's return. Well, Yaakov didn't think so, as the very next line says Yaakov was greatly frightened. How frightened was he? Well, remember back to parashah Lech Lecha. Avram defeated 5 armies in the First World War with 318 men, and here was Esav with 400. This wasn't a greeting committee. This was an army larger than what was needed to win a world war, all marching against Yaakov. Yaakov takes a few precautions, splitting up his camp and sending gifts to Esav. Military preparation and diplomacy always need to go hand in hand. With Esav and his army ready to attack in the morning, Jacob wrestles with an angel all night long, prevails, and forces the angels to bless him. The next morning, Esav and his army confront Yaakov. Now, we've all seen blockbuster Hollywood movies. We know how this is supposed to go. What should come next is a huge battle scene full of well-choreographed sword fighting and majestic cinematography. But instead, Esav hugs Yaakov, kisses him, and all the ill will seems to be forgotten. You could almost feel the confusion and disappointment that must have overtaken the 400 men, left standing with their swords drawn and no one to fight. While we're all very happy with how things turned out, after all, Esav killing Yaakov and his family would have put a damper on Jewish history, but we're all left wondering what happened. What happened that night that caused Esav to seemingly change his mind? And that is my second question. So let's recap the two questions. First, how did Esav know Yaakov was coming? And second, why did Esav change his mind? I think the answers to both of these come from looking back at what happened before. No parsha, even the most important parsha in the entire Torah, stands alone. So what did come before? Well, at the end of last week's parsha, we maybe have a little foreshadowing going on. Lavan was coming to fight Yaakov, but in the morning he decided to send Yaakov off peacefully. Sound familiar? So why did Lavan change his mind? Well, we read last week that God spoke to Lavan the night before the confrontation, telling him not to harm Yaakov. But perhaps Lavan, while obeying God's directive, didn't like that outcome and figured if he was prevented from doing harm to Yaakov, the next best thing would be to find someone else who wants to harm Yaakov and let them do the dirty work. Following that thought, maybe Lavan sent word to Esav that Yaakov was coming. Perhaps that answers our first question. That might be how Esav knew when to head out to meet Yaakov. And maybe the answer to our second question comes from the same place. Just as God appeared to Lavan the night before his confrontation with Yaakov, maybe history repeated itself and God appeared to Esav the night before his confrontation. Maybe God told Esav, beware of trying anything with Yaakov. In fact, hug him, kiss him, and receive him favorably. After all, God did promise Yaakov that he would watch over him and return him home safely. Of course, none of that is in the text itself. But it turns out that last week's parsha and this week's are tightly connected. So tightly connected that it led to an unusual machloket, a disagreement between Chazal, the rabbis who codified the weekly Torah reading, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who put chapter and verse numbers in our text. The Archbishop starts a new chapter, chapter 32, with the last 3 lines of last week's parsha, connecting them to the opening of this week, while Chazal views the first 3 lines of chapter 32 as being the closing of last week's Lavan story, while this week starts with a new Esav story. But the disagreement highlights the interconnectedness of these two parshiot, and why we need to remember what comes before in order to fully understand what we're learning right now. That's one reason why this is the most important parsha in the entire Torah. But the other reason is that the most important piece of Torah is whatever piece of Torah you have in front of you right now. Shabbat Shalom and Am Yisroel Chai.